Hello, my name is Rich Brown, and today we're talking about the importance of your tone of voice. This is the Marketing Powwow.
The QBD podcast.
The Marketing Powwow.
Is it consistent? Is it coherent? Does it say the right things? And most importantly, does it say the right things in the right way? Who are your customers? Where do they hang out online? What sort of content do they read? What sort of messages do they respond to? This is what we stand for as a business. This is what we don't stand for. You've got all your marketing activities, but tone of voice is the thing that runs right through the middle of it. Connect with those in a very human way. That's where the trust starts to build and people do start to follow you. That is the starting point that will set the guardrails for everything else that we do.
Today we have a very special guest in the studio. Jon Smart, our head of content at QBD, will be giving us an insight into why great products or services fail without the right tone of voice. The simple framework that transforms faceless businesses into brands customers actually connect with. And how to boost revenue and cut through the noise by making your brand human. So let's get into the Marketing Powwow.
The QBD podcast.
The Marketing Powwow.
Hi Jon, thanks for being with us.
Morning.
In digital marketing, we often focus a lot on what people are saying, but they don't really look at like how they're saying it. And often it can be the make or break between if products or services can work or not, and it can be that connection between if a brand fails or not. Can you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by tone of voice in a digital marketing world?
Yeah, so I think it's exactly what you said there. You know, a lot of businesses, they know what they want to say, but they don't necessarily know how to say it in a way that's going to connect with their audience. And tone of voice is exactly that. It's like the personality of the brand, what makes it different, what makes it unique, what makes it relatable to their audience.
And you've been working with brands for a long time on their tone of voice. Can you just give us a bit more of an insight into what that means and how businesses go about getting the right tone of voice?
Yeah, so it's basically the way that you present your brand online, you know, the style, the language that you use, the way you say certain phrases, what sort of brand personality is like. So, you know, are you a formal corporate type organisation? Do you want to give that professional approach, or do you want to be a bit more informal, fun, quirky? That all goes into it. And I suppose as well, it's the difference between sort of how you speak to different audiences. So using a really simple analogy, you know, if you were speaking at a wedding, for example, it'd be a totally different way to you might present and turn up at a football match, you know. So it's just making those distinctions and understanding what it is and what your audience is going to relate to.
And you say about what your audience is going to relate to. Is that one of the parts to it then, of like thinking of it from what your audience want to hear or what your audience expect to hear from you? Is there an element of that?
Yeah, exactly. I think it all comes back to customer perception and understanding, really. Who are your customers? Where do they hang out online? What sort of content do they read? What sort of messages do they respond to? And how are they written? You know, that all goes into developing an authentic tone of voice, really.
I suppose what you're saying then, it's a way for a business to really showcase their personality on all these different marketing platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the way that you want to show up online, the style that you present your branding online, you know, and there's a lot of different channels these days that businesses can be on, you know, whether it's their own website, whether it's social media, all that sort of thing. So having a tone of voice, that's all about who you are as a business, what you stand for, what you sound like, but adapting that tone, you know, the voice is the essence of your brand and who you stand for. The tone is what you use to adapt it for your different channels. So you might talk in a different way on TikTok than you would on LinkedIn, for example, because it's two different platforms, two different audiences, very different focus. But if you're still talking in the same voice and you're just adapting it by adopting a different tone, that's how you come across as authentic and consistent across all your platforms.
Yeah, and I will come back to you on that, the differences with social media and the different channels out there and that sort of multi-channel approach later. But just to stay at the moment at the core of the tone of voice, is that one of the things that you see it helps businesses with? It just sort of gives them that starting point or that focus point for not just themselves, but maybe other people in their business to go out and represent the business on those different platforms? It give them that tone.
Yeah, exactly that. And it is a starting point as well. So when we work with clients, we primarily take a deep dive into their business just to understand who they are and who the target audience is. And then we'll put all that into a document which it showcases our understanding of the business and that audience to the client, so they have confidence that we've understood what the brief is. But B, that really sets the tone for everything that we do for them from that point onwards, whether it's web content, whether it's social media content, whether it's blogs, whether it's even a bit of PR, it'll all be in that consistent voice. How we adapt that voice to the various channels, that's where the tone comes in, and that's where the understanding of the different channels comes in as well. But like you say, it's a starting point, the way that we do it for a reason, so that we start off on the right foot, and then as we continue to work with clients, we embed that tone of voice naturally across everything that we do, so it sort of evolves over time. And when more and more people sort of get involved with writing content for the business, they can follow those guidelines, so that over time it's they start to present a consistent picture and wherever they show up online.
I think it's interesting because I know you've often referred to it almost, it's almost similar to brand guidelines, isn't it? And a lot of businesses will think of getting their brand guidelines in and being really quite regimented on what colours or fonts, their logos and things, but they don't really give much thought sometimes to their tone of voice. And have you seen that in terms of where brands sort of overlook a tone of voice and where it can be detrimental to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because online content as well, it is very visual, so a lot of clients that we work with, they'll always be interested in sort of like the images that they choose for the website, or the logos and the colorways and the fonts and all that sort of thing. And you do need those guidelines to set the right framework for that to happen from a visual perspective. So why not apply the same thinking to your content, your written content, to make sure that it complements what you're doing visually and it's all consistent and coherent. And that's all that we're trying to achieve for the clients whenever we do this sort of thing, really. Is it consistent? Is it coherent? Does it say the right things? And most importantly, does it say the right things in the right way to connect with the audience that they're looking to connect with? Yeah.
And I think it's like you said, it's that thing of just getting that consistency across all those different elements. But the thing I was going to ask you a little bit more about, just almost to get into the psyche of it already, of how does it make that connection? How does it make that difference? Because I'm always in awe of the work that you do with this stuff, and I can see the benefits of getting your tone of voice in early, because, as I said, it's a bit like brand guidelines and it puts everyone on the right track. But how does it do in terms of making that business more human and sort of getting those connections with the customers?
I think one of the key questions that we ask with all customers when we first start working with them, it always amazes me as well when I ask the question about the scale. So I always say at one end of the scale, you've got like a really corporate professional business like the BBC or a Microsoft or a big law firm or something like that. Then at the other end of the scale, you've got like a Coca-Cola or an Innocent Smoothies or a Google, something a bit more fun, quirky, relaxed. And I always ask the customers where they think they sit on that scale. And the majority of them will say, somewhere in the middle, you know what I mean? But if everyone went somewhere in the middle, everyone would sound the same. So what we try to do really is to make them sort of go for one side or the other, and pull out sort of, how formal or informal do they want to be? How professional do they want to be? Can they be a little bit fun and a little bit human? It's just understanding sort of where they sit and how far we can push those sort of limits, really, to make the brand come across as more relatable to the human audience and human sounding, really. I think that's the thing, because, people, they don't buy from businesses, they buy from humans, and if they can connect with a business as human, you know what I mean, then you've got them for life. That's how you build brand loyalty, is by being genuine, being true to your audience, being true to your values, being true to yourself. And if we can capture all that and pull that all out in all the content, then we've done our job. But it all goes back again to the starting point of understanding the audience. Where do they hang out? What sort of language do they like to be spoken to in? What sort of messages do they like to receive? What sort of messages don't they like to receive as well? And if you can get all that that right and capture all that in your content, then you're onto a winner. And the other thing I'd always say as well is, it's the benefit of time. So whenever we do a tone of voice document, like we said earlier, it is always the starting point. It will always evolve over time. And we often find when we work with clients for a long period of time that, the content that we write for them early doors, especially if it's blogs, 6 months down the line, once we've truly embedded ourselves in that business and we work with them and we know what we're doing, we've got that trust with them. The content sort of a bit later down the line, once the tone of voice guidelines have had the chance to embed, that's when we sort of really get into the groove and really start, doing what
there's a real momentum into
there's a momentum behind it. Yeah, they built that tone of voice. Their audience knows what to expect and start responding to it. So, it is a process. It is an ongoing thing, and the more you do it, the better it gets, the more natural it gets, which is, I guess, what it's all about, really.
I think it's interesting you said about the expectations from the customers, what they would, or your potential clients, what they would expect to see. And I've been in meetings with you when you do that. Where on the scale would you put yourselves? And 90 times out of 100, they always stick themselves bang in the middle, don't they? And I think it's always very good that you really then do push them and say, look, no, you've got to pick a side here. You've got to go one or the other. And I think, as I mentioned, that expectation from customers is because we've done work with manufacturing businesses where typically we would see that most people do want to feel like approachable and attainable and achievable, and that sort of more slightly fun side. But we have had businesses that say, no, we're really serious actually, and we need to demonstrate because our clients need to know that we know our stuff. So we are going to use the lingo and the jargon and the acronyms and things because we need to position ourselves. And I suppose that's how you can start to maybe cut through in this sort of noisy world where everybody's shouting on social media in particular, that identifying that tone of voice and way sit on that continuum can help you sort of stand out from the crowd a bit, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that always amazes me as well when we do that little exercise and ask that question in the meetings is a lot of businesses, when they go through the branding process, they'll really think about sort of what colours they like and what, the sort of shapes they want to use in the imagery and that sort of thing. They've got a really clear idea of that. When it comes to the content, it always amazes me when we ask clients and they don't really know. It's the first time they've ever been asked the question. It's the first time they've ever been made to sort of think about sort of where they sit, really. And we often see clients, they will say, we need to sit at some point in the middle. But then when we start saying things over like, well, do you want to be seen as a bit more friendly and welcoming and nurturing and approachable? They'll often go from sort of perceiving themselves as being a very corporate and professional business, going more towards the other way because they can see the value of being able to connect with an audience in that way. And sometimes you see it the other way as well. You might see a really nice, quirky, cuddly business that come across that way or have come across that way that want to be a bit more professional and corporate and go the other way. It's always a bit of an eye opener for us as it is for the client when we ask that question and see them do the sort of the thinking in their heads before they give their answer.
And what I've seen with the work that you've done is there is a balance, and what you're very good at is sort of helping people sort of pick that path, because if they were doing it themselves or just trying to do these things themselves, you sort of run the risk of either coming across as a bit too stiff and serious or a bit too silly. I think that's the thing that people worry about sometimes, isn't it? Of how do you sort of get that balance right with that position of the tone of language. The other thing I've always been interested in as well is the ultimate effect that this has on things like the bottom line, because that is what business owners will in any sort of investment, in any marketing that they do. So how do you see it helping businesses, with bringing in or retaining clients?
I think for me, again, it's a lot of it can be intangible. If you're just doing content to get your website rankings up and that sort of thing, and there's no real sort of sales call to action, it's hard to track really, because you're just tracking how the website's ranking and the keywords that they're picking up and all that sort of thing really. So there's that. I think if you're doing pay-per-clicking campaigns and stuff like that, it's really easy because you know how many conversions you're getting from it's working. But I think when you're just sort of like trying to build a brand, it can be quite intangible. But I think the thing is, if you're noticing that people are coming back to your website, the dwell time's going up, you're getting more visitors, they're spending longer looking around your site, they might not be buying from you there and then, but you're building that base, you're building an audience, you're building that community. I often think that tone of voice, it's all about finding your audience, finding your tribe, you know what I mean? And if you speak in a certain way, with the way the internet is now, it's easier to find the people that want your content through good search. And when they land on your website and the way that you speak, the way that you put yourself across matches the sort of the visual perception of you, the brand, they do start, that's where the trust starts to build, and people do start to follow you.
Yeah, that's where the power is, isn't it? The power of that combination. I've always said to people when we talk about their websites, is one of the roles of the homepage initially for someone who's never known about your business before, is that they land on it and they are reassured immediately, I'm in the right place. I've come to the right place.
Yeah.
I'm in the right place. This is the business for me. This is the business that gets what I'm trying to do. And that is that combination of getting that, yes, the design right and your brand guidelines and all those sorts of things, but it is overlooked, isn't it, sometimes, that the words are just as powerful, if not even more powerful, than what they're reading as well as what they're seeing. Yeah. And you've got to get that mix right, haven't you?
Absolutely. And I think in this day and age as well, with AI and Google's EAT guidelines as well, Google is looking for online websites and businesses that are trustworthy and authentic. They've got people on there, and they're not just churning out the same generic rubbish that everyone else in the industry is. So if you can, it's the tone of voice that helps you differentiate your content, because if it sounds like it's coming from you and it's unique, it's a unique voice. It's coming from the people within your business. Google's always going to rank that higher than something that just reads like a list of copy that you've got from somewhere else.
I've only just thought of this, so I might put you on the spot a little bit, but I suppose that is another thing about using AI to generate your content, because as we sort of, it is, people are using it, and there are downfalls to creating your content using AI for your website. But I suppose you do lose that style in the language, don't you? Because it's not going to have your sort of natural flow, or even your sort of regional references. If you're looking to connect with local businesses, you do lose that human touch within the word. And even though what the wording says is sort of technically correct in terms of what you do, and it is, it's sort of grammatically correct, you just lose that magic about it, don't you? It doesn't have that you-ness in the wording, does it?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that having a tone of voice guide does really, is it stops you from getting sucked into that. So I mean, AI is everywhere. Lots of people use it. I use it for ideation and pulling article outlines into shape and that sort of thing, really. But if you've got a tone of voice, it stops your writing and it stops your content from following the same path as everyone else, really. So you can be different, and it helps you set that point of difference between everyone else in your industry that might be using AI a bit more than you do.
Because you will naturally have your own sort of style, don't you? And it's that style that you've got to kind of get across that will help you cut through.
Yeah, and I think Google and the other search engines as well, they're a lot better these days at picking out, They can tell straight away if content's authentic or if it's just copycat. Yeah. So that's what tone of voice, another benefit of having a tone of voice guide does, is it stops you falling too far down that rabbit hole. Yeah.
So for people that are listening to this thinking, okay, great, thanks, John, I'm sort of sold on it now. I know the sort of value of why a tone of voice would help it. Take us back to the start of it. So how do you go about finding, like, how do you start with it? If someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, I'm in, I understand what a tone of voice is now, so what's the first step? What do I need to do? Like, how do you sort of pull together a tone of voice?
Yeah. So the way we do it, really, we take a bit of a deep dive into the business as part of our discovery session, our onboarding session, if they're having content with us. So we'll sit down with the client, we'll ask them a few set questions, and just have a long in-depth chat about their business, and a lot of it centres around sort of the business story, how they started, how they got to where they are today, most importantly, why they do what they do, what the values are, why they're doing what they're doing, not just to make money, but why did they start the business, what's the passion, who's it for, and then we take a deep dive into the audience really, and that's the key to it really. Is it's a lot of business owners, they'll see it from their own perspective, they might not necessarily see it from the customer's perspective because they're not the customer. So what we do is we'll sort of take them through a process where we'll challenge that thinking a bit, get to understand who their ideal customers are, what problems they're solving for those customers as well, and where they normally look for that information and hang out. And then we'll go away and do a bit of research, or a lot of research actually, into their audience, and we'll look at the competitors, look at how they're putting themselves across and all that sort of stuff. And then through that sort of process, we'll bring it all together into their tone of voice guide. And what they'll get back there is they'll get sort of like a brand mission statement from a content point of view, how we see how we feel the business should be positioning itself based on what we've learned about it in their story, a set of values, and then like a few examples. So we'll do a bit of a word bank. We'll do some guidelines on what you should aim to do with every piece of written content that you do, which I follow and my team follow when we're writing content for the client, but the client can use themselves if they're writing content for themselves as well. Then we'll just put a list of words that we'd like to see them use in that content as well, and we try to sprinkle through the blogs and all the other content that they do, and also sort of like a bit of a breakdown of the brand personality. So is it serious, or is it professional? Is it fun, or is it straightforward? Is it irreverent? Is it technical, or is it a bit more everyman? All these sorts of things are captured in this document, which, as I say, we then give back to the client to approve. There might be a few iterations of that, but I think what the process does is, it gives confidence to the client that they know that we understand their business, but then it sets the framework for everything that we do from a written perspective from that point onwards. And we'll often use that to give to our design team as well, so that if we're doing design work on top of it, the two sort of dovetail together straight quite naturally and nice.
One of the things you mentioned I just wanted to pick on was the values element, because I think that's one of the things that I've seen that businesses might not think they struggle with, but I think they can struggle with a bit, is because identifying sort of what those brand values are. And I know Peter Bayless, that's recently been on another podcast on the powwow that he did it with Paul. He always had to have the saying of like the I would hope so. So someone would say, "Oh, our values is we offer a great service," and you think, "Well, I'd hope you do." We offer a personal service. Well, I should hope so. And how those values can really help push a business into a bit more of actually establishing their real identity that can make them cut through. And how do you help businesses with that? Because I feel personally, I'm speaking from my own experience a bit here as well, is that people don't always realise sort of what values are, like what are the different values out there and how you can choose them. And just talk me through a little bit more of that specific part of the document about how you help businesses identify what their values are to help them sort of stand out.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the values thing is really important, because I think, like I was saying earlier, people don't really buy from a business because it's a business. They buy because they align with the values and how they see the world. So that's a big part of what we do, is sort of really focusing on what those values are. And there are some values that sort of every business has, and you'd hope every business has as well. So businesses that say, "Yeah, we're honest." Well, we hope you are, because we don't want to do business with crooks, or we give great service. These things are a given. We're professional. These things are a given.
It's not actually going to help you stand out because everybody's saying that.
Absolutely.
So it's not unique.
But companies that say they give a great they give a great service might be one of the values that they think that might be more about, that value might be more about sort of community focused. So we're on your side. we do what we want. We believe the same things. We want the same things. So, the value there might be community, that we're trying to build a community around what we do, and that sort of thing. Passion, that often comes into it, a passion about what you do. A lot of businesses say they started in business because they're passionate about their product or about their service. So it's how do you get that to come across as a value, and that's a lot about, people will often say, they don't necessarily buy what you do, but they will buy why you do it. So if you're doing
the
that
why,
particular
how,
thing
what thing that you love, don't you? Yeah.
If you're doing what you do for the right reasons, that's why people buy into it, and that's why people buy into passion as a value. Values are probably warrant a podcast on its own, really, because there's so many that you can go for. But the way that we normally help customers to define their values is we'll listen to what they'll say in the discovery session that we have, and often themes will just sort of like leap back at me just based on what they're saying. So if they're they're saying that they're honest and all this sort of stuff, you often get a sense that this person's got a lot of integrity, so that could be one of their core values, is they're doing it for the right reasons.
And as you sort of touched on earlier about creating content for not just the different social media channels like Instagram or TikTok or LinkedIn, but then website content, email content, blog content. There's a range of sort of platforms out there, and it can be quite sometimes confusing, certainly overwhelming for businesses. So how do you see the tone of voice working when it is then being sent onto these different outposts of like that importance of that document, but then you can still get that sort of unique personal element to each of those different platforms?
Yeah, so I think that goes back to what I was saying about your brand voice. That's your personality. That's what you're known for. That's what you want to be seen as online. I think the tone is where you adapt that to certain things depending on what channel you're operating on. And a lot of businesses will have different people doing different things. So someone might be writing the blogs, someone technical might be writing the web content, but then they might have someone in doing the social media, doing the TikTok, all that sort of thing. So you don't want your tone of voice guide to limit what they're doing and limit the creativity, because
you need their personality.
You need their personality in that thing. It's just sort of like setting the guidelines. So this is what we stand for as a business. This is what we don't stand for. We don't want to be seen doing this, but we do want to be seen doing this, and then giving them the creative freedom to sort of adapt the messages according to the platform. Because as I say, you talk differently on LinkedIn to the way you would on X or Twitter or TikTok or Instagram or whatever. There's a different audience on there, so there's a different way of saying things. So it's just all about being authentic to your business, but also being true to the channel as well, and understanding the audience on each channel. And again, that's something that will evolve naturally. You'll see where most of the engagement is, how people like to engage with you on those platforms, and you can just become part of that conversation. And
so talk to me about the 4 dimensions. What are they?
Yeah, so I guess when you're looking at that scale that we were talking about before, that encapsulates a lot of things really. So it can be quite binary to say at one end you've got like corporate and the other end you've got totally quirky, and where do you sit on that scale? But you can break it down a bit further than that as well. So I often think one of the dimensions to that scale is how formal or informal a brand do you want to be. I think that one's quite easy to define in a client's mind as well, really, because I think a lot of them will sort of tend to towards the more informal side, because they recognise the value of coming across as human, even if they might be quite a serious corporate business. They will recognise that a lot of their audience do prefer that informal sort of tied off approach, that chatty style. Yeah. Then the next one is sort of like how humorous do you want to be? You got serious on one end and fun on the other. Where do you sit on that scale? I think I guess the question for the client there is, it's sort of like how congruent is it going to be with your actual brand? So if you're selling, components for life support machines, you don't want to be down there having a laugh talk about, because your message is quite serious. So that comes down to sort of who you are as a business and what it is that you're selling and how much fun you can have with that. You know, you'd be surprised actually at how sort of light-hearted and humorous you can be, and how much sort of personality you can inject into that side of things, even in really serious businesses. So the next one is sort of like how respectful or irreverent, if you like, you want to be to your audience. So, you know, are you talking to your audience as if they're as knowledgeable as you are about your product? So, you know, you might be using a lot of technical detail, industry jargon, that sort of thing, because they understand it. Or are you trying to not necessarily dumb it down a bit, but speak at a level where, you know, your audience might not necessarily have all that technical knowledge that you have. So, you know, you're not having to respect their technical knowledge. You know, you're talking to every man rather than the specialists, really. So that's an element of it. And then the last one is about sort of how enthusiastic or matter of fact do you want to be about your product, really. You know, we often see businesses, and you know, we are the leading supplier of this widget, and we've been doing it since 1965, and we're the best in the market, and all that sort of stuff. Is that going to connect with your audience as much as, you know, a message which might be about what we actually solve for you? You know, here's what we can do for you. You know, this is what our products do. You know what I mean? It's making it less about those and more about the audience, really. So it's where they sit on those scales. And so you've got the big scale there, you know, which is the big binary thing, but all these are considerations about where they might sit on that scale, depending on what degree they want to push it on, the formal or the informal side or the humour side or whatever.
I think what's key for me with that is the work that we've done very recently, actually, is that how that can vary, not just business to business, but within different elements of the business or charities in some cases. So we've done work with local charities where, that when they're talking about the research they do or the support or the care they give, it does need to be a bit more serious. But, you know, like, it needs to be a bit more, just considered like that. But then when they're talking about volunteering or fundraising or those sorts of bits, you want it to be a bit more. You want the language to be a bit more upbeat, I suppose, in a way. And so even within, if you just do one thing, the different audiences you have, the different things you're trying to talk about, you can sort of dial it up, dial it down, change tact a little bit, can't you? And I suppose it's ultimately about reading the room still, isn't it, really, about knowing where to pitch it?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good example that you've chosen there as well, that, you know, you've got a charity that it does a lot of heavyweight work, you know, really authoritative in what it does, you know, so you need to get that, you need to give that sort of content, that sort of gravitas. But then, you know, the other side of their audience is, you know, it's the human side of the audience. You know, you've got families there that have, you know, they're being affected by a really serious illness. So you've got to talk about how you're going to help them and, you know, how it relates to them and their lives. And it's two very different things, really. It's two very different ways of speaking. I think financial services is another sort of area where this is quite prominent, where, you know, it's, you know, you're talking about people's money, you know, and their retirement and their livelihood and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite serious stuff. But then the people that you're talking to, you know, they've got, they might have family problems, worries about how they're going to support the retirement, all this sort of thing. So you've got to talk to those and connect with those in a very human way to give them the reassurance that, you know what you're talking about, you're qualified, you can give them the best advice, you're going to look after their money and give them the peace of mind that they want. So it's quite a serious subject, but you're talking about it in quite a human way. Yeah.
And then what we were saying earlier about usually businesses, when we ask them about like where you sit on the scale and they sort of go straight down the middle, you can see where that comes from sometimes, because there's a sort of a nervousness that the subject matters they do work with, or that, you know, the people they can work with, they don't want to come across as flippant or silly, so they sort of stay in the middle. But then if you stay in the middle, then it's hard to cut through, isn't it? And so it is really that nuance with the language and that balance that you can get if you have a tone of voice guide that's sort of well crafted and considers all different aspects. It is going to give the business that opportunity to show their personalities, but also sort of respond to the different audiences.
Yeah, I think the other thing as well, and another sort of challenge that we get from clients sometimes is in their industry, they'll know that everybody talks a certain way. So IT is probably the biggest example of this, that, there's a load of IT companies out there, more than you could even count, they all talk the same way. So, they'll come to us and they'll say, well, we need to be this because our biggest competitors are this. And it's like, well, instead of being that, why don't you dial it back a bit and be this instead? Because then you differentiate yourselves. And you can only do that through tone of voice, your logo, your visuals, that sort of thing. They're not going to enable you to do that if you're not saying the right things in the right way, in a way that your audience will resonate.
And I suppose that there's that's where the skill really comes, isn't it? Because there's still an expectation of me looking for an IT company or an accountant. Accountants always come to my mind because the amount of accountants that I meet and their opener is, I'm not your typical accountant. I don't think I've met a typical accountant. Actually, they're all not your typical accountant because they're all trying to fight for that space, aren't they? And push back against the what you would think. But there is still an expectation of if I go on an IT services website, I am going to expect to see a level of sort of competency in what they do. So they do need to use a bit of jargon and a bit of technical language because there is an expectation there. But then how do you cut through? And like you said, it's finding those little paths.
Absolutely,
it?
I think IT is an interesting one because a lot of IT companies that we work with, they won't actually work with IT people. So you know what I mean. So they're IT people themselves. So they'll talk in an IT way, but the people that they work with are small business owners or finance directors and that sort of thing. You've got no technical knowledge whatsoever. So although, like you say, you've got to get across the assurance that they have got the technical competency and they know what they're talking about with that sort of stuff. They're not talking to the same audience as who they are. They're talking to a totally different audience. Who are they're primarily going to be concerned with what you can do for them and what their problems are and are you going to be able to solve them, rather than we've got this widget and it does this. And, these are the sort of things that we try to move them away from not talking about what they do, more to about what we can do for
what it means to them.
And if you can do that, that's how you build that community. You know what I mean? That's how you cut through once you make it relevant to your target audience's life and their problems and their business. And that's what tone of voice helps you to do, really.
And as we said right at the top, you do a lot of this for a lot of businesses, and we've been doing it for a long time. What does it look like then in terms of tracking it, monitoring it? Is it working? Is your tone of voice resonating? And what's the importance of for it being continuous, like keeping a momentum into it? And what's the benefits of sort of sticking with this and getting on a program that can really help build that momentum?
So it's all about consistency, really. We always advocate at QBD, we always advocate consistent marketing because it's an ongoing process. You know what I mean? You can do marketing for a bit, solve a specific problem, but as soon as you stop,
you lose that momentum.
You lose that momentum. So if you carry on, and it is a journey as well. It is a process, as I say. The tone of voice that we do, that is the starting point that will set the guide rails for everything else that we do. But if you just sort of do the tone of voice and then stop, you're not going to get the benefit of that. Whereas if you do consistent marketing, if you put out consistent, good quality content that your audience will resonate with, over time, your website audience is going to grow. Google's going to trust you more, so your domain authority is going to grow up. You're going to start ranking for more keywords, you'll get more visitors, you'll get more engagement on social media. So although you might not be able to tie these back directly to tone of voice, tone of voice is the thing. It's like a stick of rock. You know what I mean? You've got all your marketing activities, but tone of voice is the thing that runs right through the middle of it, sets those guide range and keeps everything consistent. And if those outcomes then happen as a result of the ongoing marketing that you're doing, so if you see your website growing, your social media engagement going up, email clicks going up, all those sort of metrics, really, that just goes to, that's the proof of the pudding, really. And
obviously the services that we offer here at QBD with QBD Pulse, where we're enabling businesses exactly this, where we can help them get that consistency and momentum into their marketing, is something I think that's really key. And what I've noticed with it is like you said, it's not just sometimes it's not just consistency. It's almost like a compound effect. 'Cause if you keep doing it well for long enough, it will really start to improve. Because one of the things you are able to do then is to refine your audience, refine your messages over time, and that's obviously something that you work with clients on as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I mean, if you start, so if every time you wanted to do a blast of content marketing, you did a different tone of voice, you'd never build that credibility with your audience over time. Whereas if you're consistent, you only have to do that piece of work once at the start, and then build from that. That's the start point from which you build on. And as I was saying earlier, often, you can start off with a piece of content at the start. 6 months down the line, when we've been writing for that business, we know who they are, we know who the audience are, we know what the audience are responding to, because we're monitoring it at our end as well, so we know what works and what doesn't. You can sort of refine it, and that's when the real value starts to hit, because you've already got the right foundations in place. Everything that you do from that point on, you're just building on those foundations, and as I say, over time it just sort of mushrooms, it just compounds. And everything comes together. So it's consistency is key, not just in terms of the content that you're putting out, but how regularly you're putting it out. You're trying to build something, and it all comes from that initial piece of work that we do.
Yeah, it does. And something that comes to mind actually is a client that we've been working on very recently together with, that we've been doing continuous marketing for a long time. They've been they've been benefiting from like the QBD Pulse program, where we're able to add that momentum into their marketing. And so it sort of comes back to the value of that tone of voice, in terms of giving businesses almost a space to have a bit of fun with it, like to be a bit creative. And you can do that, can't you? You can sort of push it a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having a tone of voice, it gives you license to do that, really, because it sets the guide rails so that you're going to do it in a way that's consistent and authentic with your business. But then you can sort of try something new, go off at a tangent, give it a try, and if it doesn't work, you can dial it back and do something that is going to work instead, iterate it.
And I suppose that I know you've got examples that you've sort of pointed to before, where brands have really got it right in terms of this. They have pushed the boat a little bit. They've been a little bit more risky, or they've been a bit more creative with their tone of voice, and they've really sort of nailed their audiences, like Gymshark and some of those other brands that I know you've looked at. What is it about some of those brands that you've seen that you think works, and why they were a success?
I think the brands that I like the most, I mean, Innocent Smoothies is one that I often use in meetings, and Chupa Chups as well, very similar brand. They just sort of, I just think they get their audience, and they're sort of so joyful.
There's a confidence about what they're doing. There's a confidence
about them, but they are sort of deliberately quirky, but they know their audience so well that they can get away with that. Obviously they've sort of invested a lot of money in developing their brand and their tone of voice over a number of years, and now everyone knows Innocent Smoothies and their sort of style and the way they connect with their audience.
Style's a good word, actually, because it's not just the name, we know the logo, you do know the style, you do know the quirkiness of their packaging. It's all part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think Gymshark, who you mentioned there, what they've done really well is built a community. They've built a community of like-minded people, and their business has just grown out of all of that, really. So that's a good one that I often use. I think The Economist, that's sort of almost the opposite of Innocent Smoothies, really. They again, they know who they're going after. It's quite highbrow, it's quite serious. It's quite an intellectual audience, deep thinking audience. But the way they write their content, they have a lot of fun with the content. Lots of puns, lots of clever wordplay, so they get it right. And then UFC, I think again, you've just seen how that's grown in popularity worldwide, and that's just because they know who they're for.
Well, this has been really interesting, and I know people listening to this will find it very useful. What would be your sort of top takeaways for businesses looking to develop a tone of voice, or maybe even refine some tone of voice that they already have in place?
I think the first one really is to look at the business through their audience's eyes, so through the customer's eyes. Who is it that you're trying to reach? Because it might not necessarily be who you are as people. We often get businesses come in and clients come in, and they'll like to do things a certain way, and the challenge for us is making them see, well, that might be what you like, but it might not necessarily be what your audience likes. You know what I mean? You might, if you're a 55-year-old bloke nearing retirement, but you're selling products primarily geared to young housewives, it's a different demographic, and they're going to have a different viewpoint on it. So I guess our job there is to sort of find out what that demographic is and what that viewpoint, and then hopefully persuade the client that's the right thing to do. So that's one. I think two, then it's understanding who you are as a business, what you stand for, why you do what you do, and what your values are. We can help to clarify that, because once you understand what that is, that's what goes into, that's what all your content's based on, that's what all your content's written around. So it's really essential that you've got a good understanding of your identity as a business and your brand and what you stand for, what your vision is, what your values are. Then the next one is, as I say, we pull it all together in a document. So you've got the guidelines there with examples that people in your team or whoever's writing for your business can use and start to play about with. It's clear, but it is only a starting point, as we said earlier, and then it's just letting the tyre hit the road, following these guidelines, testing your content out, testing what works, testing what doesn't, refining your messaging and that sort of thing. And as I say, over time, that's how you start to gradually but naturally embed and build your tone of voice. Yeah,
that's where you can be confident then, can't you, and be a bit more experimental with it.
Absolutely. As I say, like Innocent Smoothie is the example that we were talking about earlier. They didn't nail their perfect brand voice on day one. It took them years to build and embed within their business to the point where it's sort of it just becomes second nature to that business. So that's what we're trying to do, really, and that's the importance of consistency as well. If you're just going to do this in a short burst and then have 6 months off and then start the process all over again, you're never going to embed it naturally. Whereas if you start from day one and then keep chipping away, that's how you build an authentic business, an authentic brand, and an authentic tone of voice. No,
that's interesting. I think particularly with the consistency thing, because again, that's where that we've seen that the value of like a QBD Pulse program can help you build that consistency and can get you into that position where you are able to be nimble and react to markets or AI or competitors or changes of what your customers would want, is that you've got that foundation, haven't you, and you've got that momentum in your marketing for what you do.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing there, the really important point that you just raised really, is you never know what's going to happen. You don't know what's down the road in 6 months or 2 years. No one saw COVID coming, no one saw AI coming, but the businesses that have sort of built this base, they're the ones that can pivot quickly and take advantage of whatever's happening and ride the waves, really. If you've not got that momentum behind you, that base behind you, you're going to really struggle, because you're well behind your competitors who already have.
So thanks, Jon. Thanks for your time today. For those that are listening that want to take the next steps and heard the value that a tone of voice can give, what's next? Like, how can they get involved?
So obviously we'll put our contact details on the end of this podcast so people can get in touch either directly or through the website, and we'll sit down, have a chat. We can do that deep dive into the business that kicks the whole process off. That's what we normally do. Alternatively, we've got a new product called QBD Pulse, which always starts with a tone of voice, and then off the back of that we build that plan to do that regular continuous marketing that you need to sort of establish your brand and build your tone of voice over a period of time. So that's the option, really, but initially it all starts with a conversation, so get in touch through the website and we'd love to have a chat with you.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Thanks again to Jon for joining us today. It's been wonderful to have you in the studio and for you to share your experience with us on the show. Visit qbd.co.uk/powwow to enjoy more of our content and to find out how you can connect with Jon. All the links are in the show notes. And don't forget to like, subscribe and share the podcast so others can enjoy our content on digital marketing. I look forward to joining you again on the QBD podcast, The Marketing Powwow.
The QBD podcast.
Marketing Powwow.